We're going to witness firsthand what happens when creatures behave in bizarre and surprising ways. There's an explosive event which shocked the residents of a quiet Hamburg suburb, and a parasite that will have you gagging. But we start in the city of Rotterdam in Holland, when, in 2009, this happened. It was like something out of a Grimm's fairy tale. Look at it. The poor owner of this red Honda had something much worse than a parking ticket stuck on his car. And it didn't stop there. Everything was entangled in this mysterious web. A closer inspection revealed millions of the silk-spinning offspring of a species of ermine moth. So what were so many caterpillars doing wriggling over the surface of this thick web? Well, Dr. Ray Barnett is a moth expert from Bristol Museum. Can he explain this extraordinary event?
The adult female, flying about at night like most moths, would find the right food plant and then would lay a clump of about 50 eggs. Tiny little caterpillars hatch out, and then they will start to move about and find some food. And that's when they start to form webs.
The silk is made from proteins in the caterpillar's saliva. It's both strong and sticky. Normally, we see caterpillar silk being used to make a cocoon for their transformation into an adult moth. But in Rotterdam, the ermine moth caterpillars had a totally different plan.
They spin this silk over the food that they're on and hide underneath it. And that just means that the birds, which are the main visual predators of caterpillars, are unable to get at them easily.
And they're not the only creatures out to get them. There's also a particularly resourceful parasitic wasp which lays its eggs on their skin. Its larvae then feeds on the caterpillar.
It's in their interest, because they're nice and juicy and very attractive for birds to eat in particular, to protect themselves in that way.
The reason they chose this street in Rotterdam is because it's lined with plenty of their favourite food, the leaves of the spindle tree. But why was the web so enormous, completely covering the trees from top to bottom?
What seems to happen when we get these really big aggregations is that you've had several females lay eggs on the same plant, and so they're all joining together and making a sort of super web which can cover whole hedgerows if there's enough of them. And of course, as they get bigger, they need more food, and so the web expands and increases.
Fair enough, but this still doesn't explain why they coated the car.
As they've gradually exhausted the food supply, so they continue to look for more by spinning more web and expanding out and perhaps leaving the tree that they were feeding on to try and locate more. If you imagine yourself as a poor little defenceless caterpillar, you can't just run across the road because the birds will eat you. So you have to keep your protection with you. You have to keep spinning the web and moving underneath that web. So they're moving off the tree. They don't know where they're going, but they're looking to try and find some more food plant. And consequently, they've ended up covering all the bits and pieces around the tree, which happened to include, in this case, a car. So quite a remarkable incident. But I don't think they were fooled. They didn't think this was something to eat. They're just on their way to try and find more to eat.
So the reason for this incredible car-cooning caterpillar event was a bumper year for ermine moth, triggering a desperate race for caterpillar food and a very sticky situation for the car owner. What an astonishing spectacle. It's almost a work of motoring and caterpillar art, I have to say. Nevertheless, we are getting more reports of these things, and the time to look out for them is in May and June, especially if you have bird cherry trees or spindle trees in your garden. If you do, don't park your car underneath them. And we stay with unusual appetites for our next weird event, which is truly amazing. We're crossing the border from Holland to Germany to the outskirts of Hamburg, where in 2005 a small pond became the focus of international shock and revulsion. About 1,000 dead toads were discovered lying around the edges, their bodies appearing to have exploded. Eyewitnesses said they swelled up to about 3.5 times their normal size and then simply burst. And they burst with such an explosive force that their entrails were blown over several square meters. Nice. The amphibians affected were European common toads, and the carnage took place in April, around the time when they were spawning. Scientists initially thought that foreign racehorses at a nearby track might have brought in a virus or an infection, but when they tested the water and the toads, they found absolutely nothing. The location was dubbed the Pond of Death, and then things escalated as the death spread across the border to a nearby Danish lake. What could possibly be causing these gruesome events? Eventually, scientists came up with a theory that implicated these types of birds and placed them at the centre of this mystery. You see, corvids like this raven are amongst the most intelligent of birds. If you want to know just how clever they are, take a look at these extraordinary Japanese crows. You see, they had some tough nuts to crack, walnuts to be precise. They realised they needed some help, so they were dropping them onto the road and using cars to crack them open. Pretty brainy. But retrieving them was dangerous. So these avian masterminds took it one stage further. Just look at this. They started deliberately dropping them onto pedestrian crossings so they could collect the contents of the nuts when the traffic stopped. Come on, that is pretty clever. But what have highly intelligent birds got to do with exploding toads? Well, when scientists examined the corpses of the toads, they found a couple of interesting things. Firstly, a tiny beak-shaped mark just above where the toad's liver should be. And then when they looked inside, they found that the liver was missing. And what it appears that had happened is that the local crows had learned to peck the liver out through the body of the toad and thus avoid its toxic skin. No one knows how they learned where the liver was located, but we do know that toad's skin is so poisonous that many animals can have a fatal reaction to it. But the liver is so nutritious, it's worth working out how to extract it safely. Now, when toads are attacked by predators, their natural response is to swell up and make themselves as big as possible, so it looks as if they'd be impossible to swallow. But of course, with the liver missing and without a diaphragm, those lungs just swelled and swelled and swelled until in the end they simply exploded. Clever birds, corvids. So, the mystery of the exploding toads was finally solved by smart detective work, and it was the crows' refined taste for toad liver that was to blame. But if you thought those poor toads had it bad, wait until you see what our next weird species gets up to. For our final bizarre animal story, we're in the UK, in Lewisham, southeast London. A couple preparing a fish supper were horrified to find this sinister-looking creature staring out of the fish's mouth. Fishmonger Donna Corley was also mortified when she found one of these creepy-looking creatures in her fish.
I was absolutely shocked to see it because I didn't know what it was. Well, it's not normal really, is it, to go home and find that in a fish's mouth? They look like maggots to me. Not very nice to look at all.
These animals are turning up in fish's mouths all around the world, and the reaction is always the same, one of repulsion and loathing.
And it may look like an ordinary fish tongue. It's segmented, looks almost like a beetle, but if you look closely, it has little feet that move around and the tongue looks like it's walking. And the first time that we saw this, we were really freaked out.
So what exactly are these things, and why are they lurking in the fish's mouths? Dr. Tammy Horton is a marine biologist who has studied these unsavoury members of the isopod family, and their habits might make you gag.
All of these isopods have been called tongue biters. What happens is a larval isopod will infect by crawling under the gill cavity and settle on the fish's tongue. Now it has very sharp claws that enable it to grip onto the skin of the fish and to grip underneath the tongue and into the flesh. It will stay there and grow by blood feeding on the host. So it just chews away at the skin or part of the tongue and starts to feed from the arteries of the fish. I've seen parasitized fish with no tongue left. So the isopod itself becomes a replacement tongue for that fish. The tongue is completely chewed away and eaten up. You can see the 7 pairs of legs. Each is armed with a strong dactyl, which is like a claw, and it's these which the isopod uses to cling on to the fish's tongue. They do cling on to your finger. They grip on. And you can hold them upside down and they'll hold on with just one claw. They're that sharp and that strong. Although they cause quite a lot of horror seeing something like this, these are all members of the order Isopoda. They're very wide-ranging. They live in seaweed, they live on the seashore, they live in the deep oceans, in trenches, and also in your back garden.
You see, woodlice are probably the isopods we're most familiar with. You can find them all over the world. There are around 40 different species in the UK alone. And when you look at them, the family resemblance with the tongue-eating parasite is pretty obvious. But these two also have a big brother. The aptly named giant isopod, a scavenger found at the bottom of our deepest oceans.
This animal can walk along the seafloor quite happily and quite fast. Like the parasitic isopod, it has strong mouth parts which can be used for crushing and tearing at flesh. I wouldn't want to put my hands anywhere near this guy's mouth.
Impressive though this giant relative is, it's the habits of the little tongue biter called Cymothoa that provokes the strongest reaction.
To me, to find one of these parasites inside a fish's mouth is a moment of joy and elation because they're quite rare. But for someone who is buying a fish in a fishmonger's, to find one of these is probably the complete opposite reaction. It's one of horror and disgust.
Well, you might think, what a horrible thing, but then equally you'd have to admit that that tongue-biting parasite is a triumph of evolution. All of the adaptations it's made to survive inside its host. And when you think about it, it's easy to see where sci-fi writers get inspiration when they want to come up with their next species of alien.
Each of these bizarre stories show the extremes creatures will go to just to find their next meal. Whether you're cocooning a car in your hunt for leaves, detonating toads by pecking out their livers, or replacing your host's tongue as you drink its blood. We might find them weird or repugnant, but for the species concerned, it's a perfectly natural solution to a problem. Top marks. Now, if the little things in life can have so much impact, wait till you see what happens when we move on to the really big stuff. Our next couple of weird events are storms, and I can guarantee you won't have seen anything like them before. Coming up, we'll be finding out what made one of the world's most iconic cities look like it was built on another planet. But before that, we travel to Switzerland, to the small town of Versoix. This pretty Swiss quayside on Lake Geneva is popular with tourists, and in the summer it's an idyllic spot. But on January the 26th, 2005, the locals woke up to a surprise. You see, overnight their quayside had been transformed into a strange, eerie and beautiful natural ice sculpture. One local resident recorded what has to be one of the most extraordinary dog walks they've ever taken. Everything was coated in a thick glaze of ice, up to 10 centimetres deep. Boat owners, well, they were left with a sinking feeling as the weight of the ice had started to capsize their yachts. And some car owners, anxious to retrieve their vehicles, bravely tried to hack or melt them free. So what on earth had happened to create this astonishing scene? Well, the answer was actually simple. You see, during the night, temperatures had reached -10, not unusual in itself, but this combined with winds gusting across the lake at 60 miles an hour had produced something extraordinary. The whipped-up waves and spray hitting the quayside on the southwestern shore simply froze on the spot. And the results were nothing short of wondrous. It was a good week before the ice thawed and freed the entombed trees, benches and cars. This was a true one-off event for the residents of Versoix. A little bit of magic in the middle of winter, something none of them would ever forget.
Incredible images, haunting, like a vision from a Grimm's fairy tale.
But if those images chilled you, our second weird weather event will have you gasping. We're heading now to Australia, to its largest and most famous city, Sydney. On the 23rd of September 2009, what happened to Sydney amazed the world, because it literally changed colour overnight.
That morning, everything was drenched in red. It was almost like the colour of blood. And I could see that it was throughout the city.
From his high-rise apartment, Jonathan Berry had a ringside seat on these incredible events.
It was completely even. It was almost as if I was on Mars. It was very still, there was no wind, and I couldn't taste it, and I couldn't touch it, and I couldn't smell it. There was nothing.
6:10 in the morning, and it's September 23rd, 2009.
Sydney-siders grabbed their cameras and phones and recorded the surreal scenes.
This is unbelievable. Absolutely amazing.
6:30 in the morning. Look at this time.
I woke up and I was like, what is going on? This is, like the apocalypse, or it's like Armageddon has actually hit Earth, it was just out of this world, it really was.
Nate Johnston documented a bizarre commute to work.
This is 7 o'clock in the morning. It was really eerie, because I catch the same ride, all the scenery, and not being able to see anything in front of you was, it was almost a bit freaky. 7:20. The fact that your visibility was reduced to almost about 15-20 metres in front of you. I couldn't even see the harbour bridge until we were practically under it. It was really weird.
What had happened? How did Sydney become like the surface of Mars overnight? Well, the answer lay 2,500 kilometres away, deep in the heart of Australia's outback. Dust. Iron-rich and deep red. This is what had caused Sydney's extraordinary transformation. Here, dust storms are just part of life, but this event was really on a totally different scale. Hardened Aussie John White has experienced most of what the outback had to throw at him.
The dust storms that I normally come across are fairly short-lived, and you can see them coming. It's normally a beautiful blue sky, then you can see the dust storm coming towards you. It comes through maybe half hour or so, it's there, and then sometimes you get a bit of rain, then it clears up.
But while crossing a track, he had an accident at just the wrong time. Shortly after, a storm unlike anything he'd ever seen before overwhelmed his stricken vehicle.
The wind was absolutely atrocious. The airborne sand, you couldn't stand up in it. It was cutting into your skin. Even with my big beard, you could feel it on your skin. It was absolutely horrendous.
Atmospheric scientist Craig Strong is an avid connoisseur of dust storms.
I reckon a good dust storm is one you can taste. You know, so you can taste it in your mouth, you can roll it in your teeth, and you can say, yeah, that's about 10 microns in size. You know, that's a good dust storm for me.
Craig predicted its arrival. He'd been watching events conspire over the weeks and months leading to the storm.
We had floods in January bring new sediment into the inland parts of Australia. We had droughts in the arid and the semi-arid areas of Australia, putting the vegetation cover under stress. And then we had a really intense cold front move through, which created very strong winds. All the conditions were right to produce an incredibly large dust storm.
16 million tonnes of frenzied dust was now being whipped into the air.
At the height of the storm, visibility where I was around the truck was less than a metre. And if I had have walked over the sand dune, I can just about guarantee I would never have found my way back to the truck.
At source area, the wind speeds were up around about, they varied from 70 to 90 kilometres per hour.
It feels like sandpaper. I had my beard pulled up over my nose and
to get that sort of level of dust concentration.
This has got blacker. Oh my gosh. I think we better go inside, Ted. Yeah. Oh, that is horrible.
When it reached Sydney, less than 24 hours later, the intensity of the storm stunned everybody.
From country to city, people woke up this morning to an eerie red haze, the likes of which many had never seen before. It was all due to a dust storm.
Everything is red. So if you look around the streets, it's just red. I mean, this isn't some sort of camera error. I mean, that's what everything looks like. Another thing, radio stations keep playing music that's related to dust. So we have Dusty Springfield and Slim Dusty all blaring over the radio this morning.
I just don't know what to do with myself.
Dust storms are not unusual in Australia, but this was by far the biggest since records had begun. It also travelled the furthest and caused the most disruption.
It was phenomenal, you know, and being able to witness such a phenomenon, I don't think I will in my lifetime again, to be honest.
I've never seen anything like this at all. I know that there are dust storms in South Australia, in Western Australia and in the centre, but that's a long, long way away from Sydney.
Being here when the dust storm rolled through was quite a privilege. You know, it was really quite exciting. We now realise that we're actually sitting on the edge of a very large desert, and we can, as city dwellers, be impacted by these very large dust storms.
to realise that I was out in the start of that, it was amazing to think that where I was, that storm went that far. Yeah, it was absolutely phenomenal.
So that dust had travelled 1,500 miles from Sydney. But you know what? Our nearest desert, the Sahara, is the same distance away. Once in a while, an easterly wind will blow a sandstorm out into the Atlantic, where a westerly wind will pick it up and blow the dust to the UK. So although we don't get storms of that magnitude, even here in the UK, the Sahara Desert makes itself felt, and we can see it, dust all over our cars. Now, one-off weird weather episodes like these are awe-inspiring. But a 2011 report on climate change predicts that there's going to be an increase in what they're calling unprecedented extreme weather. So, as atmospheric conditions become more erratic, amazing events like those in Versoix and Sydney may well become more frequent. Now, the next weird events we're going to bring you have unusual weather as their root cause, with results that are for many the stuff of nightmares. It's plagues and swarms. From the beetle invasion on a remote Colorado mountain to a plague truly the size of Wales, creating havoc in its wake. We're back in Australia with an animal hated by humans the world over. It's 1993 on a farm in southern Australia, and a desperate farmer is battling a mouse plague of biblical proportions.
Oh, they're in my boots!
She's determined to save the pigs she knows are besieged in the shed by hundreds of thousands of mice. Mice which are so desperate for food, they're literally trying to eat her pigs alive. That was 18 years ago and set a world record for the worst mouse plague ever recorded. But unfortunately for farmers all across southern Australia, 2011 is looking like it's going to be another terrible year for mice.
New crops have been devoured across South Australia, Victoria and Western Australia in the worst mouse plague in almost 2 decades.
Ian Cass from Loxton, South Australia, is on the front line of this latest plague. He keeps 650 sheep on his farm. Feeding that many animals keeps him busy enough. The problem for Ian is that he's also inadvertently feeding millions of tiny mouths.
Oh, we've tried poisoning them. We've tried all sorts to try and cut their numbers.
Look at here. That's the best.
Numbers in here. Nothing works. We can't beat them. We've killed millions, but we can't beat them. They're a nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
And here are the stats. A mouse eats up to a third of its body weight every day. That's about 8 grams. Not a lot, you might think, but when you multiply that by the estimated 500,000 plus mice which are living on Ian's farm, they could consume 1.5 metric tons of grain every 24 hours. In this part of South Australia, they've been used to mouse plagues every 6 years or so, but recently it's been more like every 4. Not surprisingly, they seem to tie in with years when there's a bumper harvest, but this is not the whole story. Greg Mutzi is a pest expert. He's been studying Australia's mouse plagues and is shocked at recent events.
It's been very severe, and the population densities in the paddocks have been terrifically high, perhaps 1,000 mice per hectare across vast areas.
There would be fewer than 10 per hectare when things are normal. Now there's more than 100 times that number.
Mice have a fairly well-defined seasonal breeding pattern. They start breeding when the crops mature in September, October. They breed until the crops are harvested. Then they feed on whatever grain is spilled at harvest. At that time, they run out of food, they stop breeding and usually have a population crash.
Greg thinks that part of the problem is that changes in the way farmers grow and manage their crops now mean there's more food left in the fields during what should be the lean times. So why was 2011 such a bumper year for the mice?
This last season we had a fantastic season. We had above average rainfall and exceptional crops. It was really good.
There was plenty to eat, and this, combined with a mild winter, meant perfect conditions to kickstart a plague.
They can breed at 6 weeks of age and pump out a litter of about 6 every 3 weeks. And usually very few of them survive. 'Cause 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 very few of But during these mouse plagues, because of the abundance of food and the fact that they outnumber the predators so vastly, you get much higher juvenile survival, and the rate of increase in populations is dramatically higher.
Now, mouse plagues are strange enough in themselves, but there is something particularly weird about them.
The strange things about house mice is that although they've got almost a global distribution now, the only places where they cause these massive mouse plagues appear to be in Australia and in Western China.
So let's get this straight. There are house mice all over the world, but what's extraordinary is that they're only plaguing in 2 countries. Why? Why would this be happening? The reasons are still a mystery, but in Australia it could be partly due to the fact that house mice are an invasive species, introduced by European settlers in the late 1700s. Back home, they're a key component of a long-established ecosystem, and they provide food for some of our most iconic hunters. But here in Australia, they have few natural predators and little direct competition from the local wildlife. So when conditions are right, nothing can stop them. Except perhaps man.
Mouse plagues have become a part of the landscape in Australia and have been for a long, long time. Well, there was a massive mouse plague in 1917. 3.5 tonnes of mice that were captured in one night around a single grain stack in Western Victoria during that period.
These days, there isn't the manpower to kill them by hand, and Ian has to resort to poison. Now, I'm never keen on killing animals, but here, I have to admit, there really isn't much choice.
I estimate, and it's only my estimation, but we'd have to have killed well over 1 million out here already. You're sort of starting to see bodies starting to appear on the ground.
But there are some unpleasant side effects.
How do you describe the smell of 1 million dead mice? It stinks.
The events of 2011 have equalled Australia's worst ever mouse plague. They're munching their way through an estimated $1 billion of grain.
Horrific times there for those Australian farmers, but I have to tell you, things are very different in the UK when it comes to house mice like these.
You see, they've been so relentlessly persecuted by man that they're no longer very common.
So if you have a mouse in the house these days, it's far more likely to be a wood mouse that's come in from the garden. You can tell them apart easily. Wood mice have much larger eyes, larger ears, a longer tail, and they're perfectly white on their underside.
So, whilst they're plaguing in Australia, in UK homes, house mice are in short supply. For our next weird animal event, we feature a little creature with an altogether more endearing public image. The colourful little ladybird. Loved by gardeners because of their enormous appetite for aphids. Their popularity is reflected in their collective name, a loveliness of ladybirds. But in America in 2009, visitors to the mountains of Colorado were confronted with this.
We came upon a tree that looks like it has red bark. Only thing is, that ain't red bark.
It's certainly not, and not so much a loveliness, more of a smothering scarletness. Tens of millions of these little crimson beetles were crawling all over the trees and plants. Visitors and residents alike were confused by the sheer scale of the ladybird invasion.
Oh my God, they are everywhere. They're going to start attacking us. This is unbelievable.
You can see them all over here covering the trees, the rocks. Looks like somebody's just taken a bucket of tomato juice and splashed everything.
From the mountains of California to the Rockies of Colorado, it's normal to see ladybirds gathering together in August to mate and then to hibernate. But this gathering was on an unprecedented scale. So what was going on? Well, it turns out that 2009 was a red-letter year for these colourful little members of the beetle family. A wet spring followed by a soggy summer meant a bumper year for aphids. These tiny insects reproduce at an alarming rate, and more of this ladybird food means more ladybirds, lots more ladybirds. By 2009, in August, ladybird numbers had reached astonishing levels. The resulting massive mating and hibernation gatherings were truly a unique and wonderful spectacle. But the next weird gathering of insects is not so benign. In fact, it's one of the most destructive forces in the invertebrate world. We are back in Australia, where in 2010 the country was hit by a plague, which was both uncontrollable and unstoppable.
Swarms of locusts are sweeping across rural areas in the Australian state of New South Wales.
Up to 1 billion locusts in a swarm moving over an area twice the size of the UK were sweeping across parts of southern Australia and creating mayhem.
My friends and I we saw this big, it was kind of a brown cloud, and we thought it was going to rain or something, but we stepped outside and we stuck our hands in it and there were just locusts.
At Irimple Primary School near the outback town of Mildura, the kids were enjoying their playtime when the swarm hit.
So, millions. 100 million? Billions. Probably trillions. Lots of them. It just felt disgusting. Mostly all the girls, they would just go, ah!
But it wasn't just the kids whose playtime was being disrupted by the millions of winged visitors.
Local sporting clubs are at their wits' end too, as the interlopers crowd their bowling greens and fairways.
From tennis courts to golfing greens, anywhere with a bit of grass was fair game. In Mildura, the local football team were forced to take on 2 different opponents. But whilst the locusts were causing chaos in the town, it was altogether more serious out among the farms. Here the locusts were not just an inconvenience, they were a devastating force. Professor Simpson is one of the world's leading experts on locusts and knows all about their destructive power.
They eat each day about their own body weight in food, and when you multiply that single locust by hundreds of millions or billions, you can get the sort of devastation that we see.
But what's really weird about locusts is that they all start life as a harmless little grasshopper, one who shuns company and prefers a solitary life. It's true, they prefer to be on their own. So what could possibly change them from shy singleton into a voracious, gregarious plague insect?
When conditions favour a large build-up in population, for example after rain, and then they get brought together by food in their environment, they flip from being shy, solitary animals into being actively aggregating, potentially swarm-forming creatures. And we wanted to know, why do they do that and how do they do that? That's the key to being a locust rather than being a normal grasshopper.
The prof had a theory that it was something to do with being in close contact with other locusts, and so they set about testing this theory in a rather unusual way.
So we sat for many, many hours in hot rooms, tickling locusts on different body parts with a paintbrush and then measuring their behavioural change as a result of that. And we found that touch alone can cause a locust to switch very quickly into the swarming form.
They found that the touching releases a hormone similar to serotonin, which we associate with pleasure, and it's this which triggers the change from grasshopper to locust. But our locusts are just wingless hoppers at the moment, and they move across the country as a kind of marching, hopping army. After 5 weeks, their wings are finally ready. So now the locusts can take to the air and are capable of covering vast distances. And for the farmers, this is the start of the real nightmare. These airborne swarms have become unstoppable eating and breeding machines, and frankly, nowhere is safe. On the outskirts of Mildura, farmer Terry Bavidus had everything to lose as the swarm approached his farm.
We'd had a very good start to the season, and my hay was about 6 inches high. I came home about 10 o'clock one morning for a cup of coffee, and I walked outside and there was just this humongous plague of locusts just outside, and I didn't know where they'd come from. And I knew straight away my crop was going to be decimated. There was about 5 or 6 locusts hanging off each strand of hay. By 4 o'clock that afternoon they had decimated about 12 acres. It's just not funny at all.
But Terry wasn't going to get mad, he was going to get even.
A friend of mine had found an exhaust fan out of a paint shop, and I've got it rotating at 290 kilometres an hour. I had to pinch the kid's go-kart motor to do it.
Terry had created the locust muncher. And it was payback time.
I was getting rid of hundreds per second. I couldn't tell you how many. A friend of mine, Mick, he called me the nutty professor. Every single person that went past laughed their head off. So hey, it works.
Terry's Mad Max solution might have helped to save some of his crops, but the plague continued moving relentlessly across the country, gobbling up field after field of precious crops. Meanwhile, back at Sydney University, Professor Simpson had made a remarkable discovery about what was driving their insatiable appetite. The locusts were actually craving protein.
And the nearest source of protein within a locust swarm is the locust in front of you. So cannibalism drives mass migration in these swarms. They're on a forced march, if you like, to avoid being somebody else's lunch, but chasing the lunch in front of them.
The cannibalistic tendencies of these insects did little to endear them to the residents of Mildura, who were capturing their locust encounters on camera.
Driving, it's hard to tell the road from the locusts.
Yeah. My mum hated that because she'd have to get like a car wash like once a week because of those locusts.
The dogs liked them. They just, because when they splattered on the car, they just licked them off.
Australia's 2010 locust plague lasted 12 long months. It covered 190,000 square miles, and apart from the inconvenience, it was estimated that it cost Australia's farmers $2 billion. It's not surprising those locusts cover such vast distances. What more motivation would you need than your nearest neighbour arriving and then turning cannibal to eat you? We'd all move on, wouldn't we? The trigger for all of these plagues was an abundance of food. The mice benefited from a record harvest. For the ladybirds, it was a wet spring that meant huge amounts of aphids. And the locusts benefited from a bumper start to the growing season. When these tiny creatures mass together, they become greater than the sum of their parts, often with dramatic results. For our final weird events, we're heading down to the beach, where we'll be seeing what happens when sea creatures end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. From the crabs that were found in their tens of thousands on a UK beach, to the baffling event involving 200 whales in Tasmania. But we start in the UK, where in 2010, visitors to a West Country beach were greeted with a scene of total devastation. Starfish were lying dead in their thousands, for no apparent reason. These familiar sea creatures are not actually fish at all. They're echinoderms, related to sea urchins. So they're unable to survive for long out of the water. But what on earth caused this many to wash up dead on a single beach? The answer lay in an unfortunate combination of events. You see, the starfish had just been mating. Each female produces up to 65 million eggs in a season, and they prefer to do this in shallow water. The starfish were weakened after breeding, and a nasty Atlantic storm simply washed them up onto the beach. Battered and exhausted, they were unable to make their way back into the sea, so they dried out and died. The sad result was actually totally natural, but nevertheless was upsetting for everyone who witnessed it. Staying in the UK, just 10 months later, on January the 4th in 2011, Thanet in Kent played host to another grisly scene. This time, the bodies of 25,000 velvet swimming crabs literally carpeted the beach. Now, there are over 5,000 different species of crab in the world. They all use gills to breathe, but some can live on land as well as in the sea. But velvet swimmers are strictly underwater species, and being on the beach is a death sentence. So why on earth did thousands end up like fish out of water, lying dead all over the beach? Well, unlike the poor old starfish, the answer lay not below the water, but above it. Britain was in the grip of an unusually cold winter, and the weather was having a chilling effect on the ocean too. The crabs simply couldn't cope with the severe cold and died of hypothermia. Admittedly not a pleasant end for them, but it was a lifeline for the seabirds who were also suffering in the cold temperatures. Fortunately for both the starfish and the velvet swimming crabs, numbers recovered very quickly, and there were no long-lasting effects on their species. For our final weird event, we're heading into uncharted waters with some much-loved creatures whose lives hold so much fascination for us, but also many mysteries too. Whales are found in every ocean on the planet. The size of their brains rivals that of primates. These are complex creatures which have evolved to navigate our seas and make epic migrations. So why on earth would such an animal do this?
The northern bottlenose whale remains some distance upriver. The time for rescue teams to move in is getting ever closer.
January the 19th, 2006, and all eyes were on London as a northern bottlenosed whale turned up in the Thames.
Rescuers battling to save the whale stranded in the Thames say the next few hours will be critical to its survival.
This creature would normally be found in the depths of the North Atlantic, so what was it doing in the middle of our capital city? It's likely that this young adult had simply got lost and was trying to reach Atlantic waters, but heading west up the Thames wasn't going to get it anywhere. Rescuers eventually stepped in and winched the distressed and exhausted whale onto a barge.
We're now moving it out into the centre of the Thames. The crowd obviously is going crazy because it's been a long ordeal here for the poor creature.
But despite their best efforts, on the journey back down the Thames, the whale sadly died. Now, an individual animal making a mistake is one thing, but we are now heading to the Southern Ocean and to the island of Tasmania, where in 2009 a whole group of whales stranded on a quite horrifying scale.
Rescuers are tonight trying to save the survivors from another mass whale stranding in Tasmania.
It was March the 1st, and almost 200 whales were piled up along the Tasmanian beach. These scenes on King Island were horrible. Many already lay dead in what was one of the largest mass strandings of whales ever recorded. volunteers flooded to the beach to try whatever they could to keep the remaining animals alive. So what could possibly cause such creatures to commit what amounts to mass suicide on the beach? What we can say with some certainty is that there are 85 species of cetacean in the world, yet only 10 of these regularly strand in any numbers. This starts to tell scientists something about why these events might happen. In the UK, whale rescue is coordinated by the British Divers Marine Life Rescue and run by Stephen Marsh.
One whale species that seems predisposed to stranding, to mass stranding, is the pilot whale. Pilot whales are called pilot whales because they follow their leader. What happens is that they will follow one animal wherever that animal goes. If that animal has problems and go up onto a beach, the rest of the animals will try to go with it as well.
The fact that these are highly social animals helps explain the large numbers, but it doesn't answer what on earth causes them to go on what amounts to a death wish. That's where, frankly, it gets complicated. There are many theories, but none that could explain every incident. But one clue could come from the factor that unites all of the species that mass strand. They all use echolocation. In Tasmania, at the Australian Antarctic Division, Nick Gales is a marine mammal specialist who studies whales in these southern waters.
Well, effectively, if you like, you could have a group of animals that are quite used to living offshore. So they're very, very skilled at living beyond the continental shelf of the various continents, and they feed out there. Occasionally their prey will come in very shallow and that'll bring them into the coast. You get storms and it stirs up the water. And while it looks very obvious to us standing on the beach that there's a big beach there, if you were to put yourself 50 metres offshore with a face mask on, swimming around, and not look above the water and get a clear picture, it's very easy to get disoriented. And even though these whales have fantastic underwater sonar, when it's very rough and there's a lot of sand in the water, they're effectively semi-blinded.
Also, with these whales relying on echolocation to navigate, the inevitable question is, does human activity in our seas have a role to play in causing them to come ashore?
Man has a habit of putting barriers in front of a lot of sea creatures, and one of those is acoustic pollution. This can be caused by military activity where they're out there hunting submarines or using sonar at the same level that whales and dolphins are going to be communicating at. For them, it must be like sticking your head inside a loudspeaker. We're muffling the sound and we are creating something that's really going to frighten them.
But how much blame can be pinned on human activity is debatable, because mass strandings have been reported for centuries, long before we pumped noise into our oceans. Whilst we don't understand all of the reasons they come ashore, once they're here, it's a race against time to get them back into the water. Amongst the volunteers who helps rescue whales in Tasmania is Chris Carleon.
There is a lot of death and that's quite hard to deal with, but that one animal that you get back in the water and released and successfully watch it swim away, it's pretty special.
But is returning them to the ocean actually the right thing to do? Can they really survive after all of the trauma they've suffered? Marine biologist Rosemary Gales heads the Tasmanian rescue team, and she's done some pioneering work which gives the rescuers hope.
Over a year ago we deployed some satellite transmitters on some pilot whales that we released up in the northwest of Tasmania, and we put 5 out, and then over the next month we followed
weakened starfish onto a beach, sub-zero temperatures giving crabs a fatal case of hypothermia, or the tragic stranding of 200 pilot whales. When things go wrong in the sea, our beaches are often the places where we get to unravel the mysteries and pick up the pieces.
What all of these stories prove is that nature's weirdest events still have the power to shock us, to stop us in our tracks and have us stare in awe. And whilst many of these phenomena are explained, many remain a mystery. And there is one thing for certain, and that is that nature still has plenty of surprises just waiting to happen.
Next time on Nature's Weirdest Events, incredible holes open in the Earth's crust. There's a frightening mystery in Arkansas.
What makes that happen for them just to drop out of the sky like that?